We're in this weird waiting around period. And the key issue is, see, the Americans have to figure out if they really want to go to war, to kinetic war, with anybody. Because you see, they're desperate to go to war with somebody, okay? I mean, they have this huge army, the biggest army, the most powerful military force on the planet, right? But what has happened is that over the past 4 months, what is it? February, March, April, May, June, 4 months. Over the past 4 months, they've got a good look at what the Russian military has on offer. And the Americans have concluded correctly that they don't have what it takes to have a war with the Russians. They can't fight the Russians because they'll lose, and they'll lose catastrophically. Well, that's a fact. And insofar as China is concerned, the American military is probably realizing that its great weapon, its aircraft carrier battle groups, well, they are fantastic for small and medium-sized countries. Fantastic for those. They scare the bejesus out of a small country or a medium-sized country. A country like Iran, for instance. Iran is a great power, but it's a medium-sized power. It's not a great power. You know what I'm saying? And so for those kind of middling and smaller countries, an aircraft carrier battle group is fantastic. But for a peer country, a peer power, or a near peer power, militarily speaking, they're a huge vulnerability. Yeah, because the peers at this time are the Russians and the Chinese, and they both have hypersonic weapons that, as a practical matter, will get through. If you send a swarm of these missiles, of these hypersonic missiles, you send 20. If you have, just a 15% rate of actually hitting the target, the other 85% of these missiles get blown up by missile defense forces and air defense forces and whatnot, right? But only 15% get through. Those 15% of 20 missiles, 3 missiles, that'll sink an aircraft carrier. It will. And an aircraft carrier has, I think it's 4,000 or 6,000 military personnel. The Americans politically cannot handle such a loss. And more importantly, and what's really interesting, is that the Americans are realizing that industrially, they can't compete. And this has them completely freaked out. Yeah, because what happens is that, last week, or we're coming up on 2 weeks now, there's a guy called Alex Vershinin, as I understand it. He wrote here, I have it right here in front of me, in the Royal United Services Institute website. The RUSI is like a big old think tank that the Brits have. He called it The Return of Industrial Warfare. And the upshot of the very, very influential article that everybody read, everybody who cares about this kind of stuff read, is that basically the West does not have the industrial capacity to match the Russians. This is something that I thought of before the start of this war. Before this war, I thought if there's ever a great power war, the tempo of combat, the speed and relentlessness of it is going to be never before seen in human history. And this has proven to be true. The Russians, it's 24/7 with them. They're on the clock all day long. Missiles, attacks, everything. It's relentless. It's real industrial warfare, right? I mean, if the first time we had industrial warfare was the U.S. Civil War, and then the next big step was the First World War, and then the Second World War. Well, here we are in the Third World War, and this is relentless. This does not stop. And the Americans simply don't have what it takes to fight the Russians. And this is what Alex Vershinin is basically saying. The West does not have the industrial base to replace all the artillery, the missiles, all this stuff. And also what's happened is that, see, the Russians have done a lot of little things that have gotten more bang for the buck. I've said many, many times the story of how the Russians came up with the zero-gravity pen. It was a problem that NASA had, that they needed a zero-gravity pen. So NASA spent $1 million to develop a zero-gravity pen. And you know what the Russians did? They started using pencils. The Russians have a military budget that annually is about 1/15 the size of the Americans. Yeah, it's roughly 7% of the Americans' annual budget. Yeah. What is it? Yeah, because the Americans have 800 billion a year and the Russians have like 65 billion. Yeah. Less than 10%. It's about 8%, 7%, something like that. Yeah. And, well, the thing is, see, the Russians save money. They get more bang for the buck. And this very interesting article by Alex Vershinin basically pointed out that if the US were to go to war, if NATO were to go to war, the tempo of weapons being used on the battlefield, I mean, looking at the Ukraine conflict now, it proves that the US would not last more than, 8 weeks or something. They wouldn't have the material to go the distance. And they don't have the factories to replace the stuff that they've got. If they go up against the Chinese, they have a huge vulnerability with their aircraft carriers. And so if they go up against the Russians or the Chinese, it's likely that they will suffer a catastrophic defeat. And they can't handle that. And so what are they going to do? And so right now, there are some sensible people in the West who are arguing for negotiations in Ukraine and try to rebuild some status quo with the Russians, which is going to prove impossible as far as I'm concerned. And the Russians now hate the Europeans, and more importantly, they don't trust them, okay? And so they're never going to do business with the West ever again. And so Europe is going to go cold this winter. That's in the cards, man. Okay, but anyway. There's that one segment that wants to negotiate and the other segment that wants to double down. And those types of people in Washington, in London and whatnot, they're the ones who have been pushing the Lithuanians into goading the Russians. They're the ones who are, getting these meetings together with Arab leaders to see how they can go to war with Iran. They're the ones who have this itch that they need to scratch, yeah? And see, if the itch were all about pussy, well, that'd be fine. But it's about going to war, man. I mean, come on. And I'm laughing because if I weren't laughing, I'd be screaming in horror. And I'm not kidding. Because this is horrifying. These madmen, they are so hell-bent on war that they are trying to figure out, well, if we can't fight the Russians because we don't have the industrial capacity, and we can't fight the Chinese because we'll lose our aircraft carriers, who do we fight? That's the attitude of a madman. And that's who's leading the United States. And I'm not fucking kidding here. This is serious business. Okay, let's go through the numbers. We see the Russians in the Donbass. They're winning. They're going to take over the whole goddamn country. After that, what happens then? Let's fight Iran if need be. I mean, that's what these crazy people are thinking. Or negotiation, peace, a settlement, a new status quo. But the problem is that the Americans cannot allow that. They cannot. They cannot allow that to happen because the Americans, or at least a subgroup of the American leadership class, understands that right now they are in an existential crisis. This is for all the marbles. Because if the United States doesn't somehow come up on top, in their estimation, then the United States will cease to be the global hegemon. It will be just another great power among three. And these people, because of their ego, cannot stomach that. And that's why more people are going to die.